Okay, so once you have your sleeve, I have lots of pieces here, but once you have your sleeve done and you've walked it, and your ease is somewhere in the neighborhood of like 1¼ to 3/4 of an inch, somewhere in that neighborhood, then you're ready for the next part, which is, like if we were to skip way ahead, we want to make a sample. Her back is facing us now, but you see that sample? And it's really similar to what we did with the skirt in 1A, where you take your pattern, well, first you take your muslin and you press it and you block it, and then you draw the cross grain on it, and then you draw the straight grain on it, and then you match your pattern up to it, and you trace around your pattern, and you transfer all the markings, and then you add your seam allowances. But before we can do any of that, we need the markings on the pattern so that we have notches and punch holes. We know where to sew the darts and all that. So that's where we're at now. So when you are walking your sleeve, so the sleeve instructions told you where to put the front notch and the back notch. And then when you were walking your sleeve, hopefully you transferred it. If you didn't, you can walk it and transfer your notches. So we have those. So we know where those go. So once I cut this guy out, I can just use my notcher and transfer those notches so that I can see them from the right side too. I can kind of see them because my pencil marks. What other notches do you know about already? Dart notches, right? So wherever there's a dart leg, we're going to put a notch. So we have notches here on the back shoulder dart, and on the back waist dart. And then if we go back to the sleeve, because he's here, we have notches here on the sleeve dart. And then, so that's that. And then we have notches here for the front waist dart. And then on the skirt, the one that matches is over there, but I'll just grab whoever's closer. So on the skirt, you'll have notches on the waist darts. Okay, so we took care of the dart notches, and we took care of the armhole notches. So the next thing we need are the notches on the skirt to indicate back. So at center back, because this you'll remember from 1A, you get one notch at the HBL, and then a 1/2 inch below that, you get a second notch. And that's usually where the zipper ends. So the zipper goes just a little bit past the HBL to give enough opening for the person to get into it. On our sample, we won't be putting a zipper in, but we will sew from the hem up to that notch, and then leave from that notch all the way up to the neck open so that we can get her in, but we're not putting a zipper in it. The other notch that we need on the skirt, both front and back, get my tools off of here and roll this up. The other notches that we need on the skirt are, things are going to go flying to the floor, I'm sure. Just shut that up. So the other notches that we need on the skirt are the HBL notches, right? And then I think for skirt notches, we're fine. So you have your center back notches, your HBL notches at the side seam, but on the center front, there's not going to be any notch on the center front, at least not horizontally, because that's on the fold. So if we put a notch there, there would be a hole right in the middle at a very unfortunate position. So no notches on the center front HBL. It is a good idea on your center front pieces to write CF. I haven't written it there because this document was more about notches and punch holes. But on your patterns, you want to make sure that you have CF on it. And then your dart notches, and then these are, at this point right now, they're on the half still, so these are not on the fold, which they will be someday. when they're on the fold, you'll have a notch at center front going this way, and that's what that little teeny weeny red mark is about. It's the half of a T from a T notch. So you don't worry about it yet because it's on the half, but for the future. So that's that guy's notches, and then the only other thing he needs is the punch holes. This is a sloper, so it has no seam allowance. Therefore, normally on a sewing sample, you only notch a 1/2 inch inside of the dart. So you back off of the termination point a 1/2 inch and put your punch hole there. But this is a sloper, and it's for manipulating. And so we want to know where the termination point is, because a lot of the times when we're manipulating the dart, we need to know where the whole thing is. Also, sometimes when we trace it, we're making a style, and so we also want the punch hole. So if we're keeping the dart the way it is, we'd trace it off and just transfer the punch hole rather than having to measure it. So because it's a sloper, you'll get both the termination point and the punch hole, and you'll go ahead and punch those. So I have them punched, and then you'll circle those. And then same thing on the back. So we talked about center back notch, one at HBL and 1/2 inch below, side seam notch at the HBL, and it's at the HBL for a bunch of reasons. One of them is that this is a super long seam, and when you're putting these two together, you want just like a checkpoint to make sure that things are lining up before you get all the way through it and realize that they don't match. So that's why you have a notch on that seam. The reason it's on the HBL is, one, yes, because it's the HBL and that's an important landmark, but the other reason that this is a good spot, there's two more. One is that this is a curve, and then this is straight, and curves tend to do weird things. So it's nice to know that this is either the end of the straight line and the start of the curve, or vice versa, the end of the curve and the start of the straight line. So that's another reason that it's a good spot for a notch. One more reason that it's a good spot for a notch is that if I folded this skirt in half, this notch is not right in the middle. Because if it was right in the middle, some goofball who was sewing it for you could flip them, and still the notch would still match even though they had one of them upside down. So off center is good. HBL, good landmark, and also a good landmark because it's a transition between a curve and a straight line. And then you need one just because it's a long seam and you need to know where to match it up. So it's obvious why you'd have notches and punch holes on a dart, because without it you have no idea how long it is or how much to suck up. But on seams we also have notches to tell us, just a checkpoint to make sure you're sewing it correctly at that point. So when you get there, those two notches should be lined up. If they're not, go ahead and stop and fix it. That's what that's about. And then this one we already know, its reason for being is it's the fullest point and it's where the zipper should end. So that's those guys. So once you have all your notches and punch holes on them, you're ready. Also make sure it's a draft, and so the HBL was part of your draft and the darts were part of your draft, so all those lines should be on there. And the measurements are good to know also, because you're going to be transferring those lines and those measurements to your manila, and then using that sloper to manipulate. And if your measurements are already written on there, then you don't have to think. Later, when you trace it off, you can just refer to it and see your measurements and move on to the next thing. Okay, so that's the skirt. Let's go ahead and roll him back up. Oops. A few things will be flying. And then we'll move up to the bodices. So hang on to the sleeves for a little while. So here we have front bodices. And there we have back bodice. Okay. And I don't have it. Okay. So for the front bodice, thank you. For the front bodice, we have the armhole notch, which we already talked about, and we have the dart notches, which we already talked about. You want to make sure that the bust level is on your pattern, but you don't need to notch it like the HBL. We'll just you can see there's little like dots here. When you put it on your muslin, you kind of do the same thing. You make like little dot and then use your ruler to connect the dots so that you can have your cross grain on it. It's a dart, so we do need the punch hole, which is backed off a 1/2 inch from the termination point. It's a sloper, so we also put a punch hole for the termination point. And it's a sloper, so we also put a punch hole for the bust point. Because a lot of times when you're manipulating it in a few weeks, 2 weeks possibly, 1 week. I'll look at the schedule. We're going to be doing dart manipulations because you can move this dart all over the place, and so you'll trace off your sloper and then you'll say, oh, I don't want the dart at the waist, I want it in the side seam, or I want a French dart, or I want it to come out of the neck. Wherever you want it to come out of, it rotates around the bust point. So for that reason and some others, the bust point is important because as a sloper, we have bust point, termination point, and punch hole because the point of this is to manipulate it and we need those landmarks. Once you have that for the for this half draft, that's all the notches you need. Someday, when it's on the fold, you'll also want a notch at center front waist to match to the skirt center front waist notch. And you'll also want a notch at center front neck to match to whatever might be there, a facing or a collar or whatever. But this is only on the half, so you don't want to half notch it. So, but just know that those are gonna be there someday. And then for the back piece, you want the armhole notches we already talked about. You want the dart notches we already talked about. So you have them at the shoulder and at the waist. And then you also want your punch holes, just like everything else on the sloper or the block. We not only want the punch hole that's backed off from the termination point a half an inch, but we also want the termination point. So you want to make sure you have both of those. And then for the sleeve, we have, I think we talked about everything on the sleeve. We need the notches for the dart, and we need the notches for the armhole. Oh, there's one more notch on the sleeve that we didn't talk about. You measured your ease. There's my sleeve draft. You measured your ease. And usually what we do is we divide the ease in half, and right in the middle there, we put a notch. And the notch should not be on the center of the sleeve. So we have our center of sleeve line. We don't need a notch there, but we need a notch that shows where the middle of our ease is, so that we can evenly distribute half the ease towards the back and half towards the front. So you'll end up having, it's called a center of sleeve notch, but it's not the center of the sleeve, it's the center of the ease. So when I drafted this one, my notch was right there. So, and again, it's center of sleeve, even though it's not really the line that we drew for center of sleeve. So that notch, when we sew the whole thing together, that notch is where the front and the back shoulder meets. So that's, you stick that on that seam. And then the ease, actually, even though when we walked it, we decided our ease ended up right there, when we actually sew the sleeve, the ease will be distributed between the armhole notch and the center notch. So you have that whole space to make the ease disappear. In some garments, they want it more concentrated up towards the ball, so they'll put a couple more notches. But for us, we have that whole space, and we'll do our ease stitch all along that whole curve. So once you have all your notches and punch holes down, the next thing you need are grain lines on everything. So you have your draft lines, some of them are vertical and some of them are horizontal. You want to keep those, so you need your, like on your sleeve, you need your biceps level, your elbow level, and your wrist level. But you also go ahead and take that center line and turn it into a nice dark black grain line with arrows on each end. So the grain line runs all the way off the edges of the pattern, and there's arrows on both edges. For us, we have arrows pointing in both directions, because what that says is on my fabric there's no directional pattern. So I could cut my sleeve like this, and if it fits well on the fabric, I could cut my other sleeve, I would flip it over because I need it right and the left. But I could cut it with the head of the sleeve and the wrist facing the opposite directions. And my little print or whatever won't look upside down or whatever, because muslin has no print. So that's what those arrows on both ends mean. If I was cutting it out of velvet, then I would have an arrow only on one end, so that my people would know that if you have one sleeve going this way and one sleeve going this way, one's going to look dark and one's going to look shiny, and whoever I'm selling it to will send it back to me because it's wrong. Or if I have like some Disney princess print or whatever, and they're all standing up, and I turn one piece of my pattern upside down, then those princesses are going to be standing on their head. And again, it will get returned to me. So, or if they put the arrow in the wrong direction and they're all standing on their head, that's also a problem. So the arrows, usually if they're on both ends, it means you can flip the pattern either way on the grain line, upside down or right side up. But if the arrow is only pointing in one direction, that means that you have to have it aiming in a certain direction. So grain line down the middle of the sleeve line that we drew, the A to B line. On most other pieces, the grain line is 1 inch away from center. So because these are on the half. When they're on the fold, they like you to unfold it and draw the grain line right on the fold. But because these are on the half, the convention is that the grain line is usually 1 inch away from center. And again, it should run all the way off the end of the pattern and then have arrows at the end. A nice way to get a good arrowhead is, so for this guy, I have an L-square yardstick somewhere. My L-square is under here buried. Because the sleeve is longer than 18 inches, an L-square yardstick is nice to be able to draw a nice smooth grain line. So, I haven't cut him out yet, but that's okay. It's fine to draw the grain lines before. So I'll make sure that I'm right on, and then draw the grain line. And then, in order to get nice arrowheads, what I do is I take my ruler, and one of those 1 inch squares, I just have my grain line bisect it, so that one end of my grain line is going through one corner of the square and dividing it into 2 triangles, and the other end of my grain line is going through the edge of the ruler part of the square, and then I just draw my arrowhead like that. So that's how you can get a nice even arrowhead that's not crooked. So I would do that on both ends. So on the center back bodice, center front bodice, center back skirt, and center front skirt, the grain lines on these halves will be 1 inch away from center. And then the labeling. So on every single pattern, you'll have a label. I have this that I can put out for you. I'll roll it back out on that table again so you can take a picture. You need the name of the pattern, so just like that thing up there. So you need, the first thing is your style number. And what I thought, I don't know what I did when I made this. So I made it 010. But on the one that I drafted this semester, I made it 501, so 5 for Fash005, and then 01 for our first pattern. So it's your initials, first, middle, and last, and then a dash, and then a number. And on mine, I'll be putting 501, but on this sample, it's something else. At any rate, every single piece of your basic block pattern will have that same style number at the top, so your 3 initials, and in my case, 501. So mine's HLL 501. Then the next thing on your labeling is the name of the whole. So this whole thing is the basic block. So every single one will have a style number and basic block on it. And then the next thing that you put on there is the name of the piece. So you'll have sleeve, front bodice, front skirt, back skirt. And then the next thing is the size over how many you cut. So the fronts, you're only going to cut 1 because they're going to be on the fold. And everything else is cut 2. So you need 2 sleeves, a right and a left, 2 back skirts, 2 back bodices, a right and a left. But everything else is on the fold, or everything else. The 2 fronts are on the fold. And then normally, right next to the size over number of pieces to cut is the fabric that it's being cut out of. But in this case, what's really important about this pattern is that it has no seams. So if someone tried to cut it and sew it like a normal pattern, first of all, they'd have serious punch hole problems because they'd have punch holes on the apex, and they would have the termination point and the punch hole, and they wouldn't know what to do with that. But even worse, it would be way too small because it has no seam allowance on it. Therefore, it's really important that we make it clear that this has no seam allowance. So in red, we write seamless where we might normally write self, and we circle it in red. Then you write your name and then the date. So the only thing that changes on the different pieces would be the piece name and the cut number. Everything else will stay the same on every single piece. And I mentioned at one point last week or the week before that some people were typing them and then printing them out and then cutting them and taping them on. If you want to do that, that's fine. It keeps it nice and neat, and then you don't get bored writing the same style number and basic block over and over again. But if you're going to write it, just write it. Everything should be in black except for seamless and circling of punch holes, and write it as neatly as you can. Then what else do we need? We have the notches, we have the punch holes, we have the labeling, we have the grain lines. And again, keep all of your horizontal draft lines. So on the back of the bodice, you want your shoulder blade level line, and on your sleeve you want wrist level, elbow level, biceps level. On the front bodice you want bust level, and on the skirts you want the horizontal balance line. So you need all those horizontal lines, because I put the block on there inside out so you can see all the lines. We use those to see if it's balanced. So the bust level line should go straight from apex to apex, and then it should dip down on the side seam. So we use those to see how it works. And then on the sleeve, we use the grain line and the horizontal levels to see that it's hanging the right way and hitting the side seam the way it should. So you want all those on your draft so that you can transfer them to your muslin eventually. So the next step is to get all of your notches and punch holes on your block draft, and then your labeling, and then I'll post another video about transferring the dot paper patterns to muslin. Okay?
You do muslin before vanilla? Yeah, because you want to
Yes.
try it. Like,
Yeah, exactly. You want to test it before you spend all that time and expense transferring the dot paper to manila.